Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar in our series on strengthening advocacy in the HCBS settings rule. Let me see, where's my mouse here so I can advance the slides. All right, the transition period for the settings rule is quickly coming to a close, but our work on improving and expanding access to HCBS is only beginning. At ACL, we believe stakeholder engagement is critical to effective implementation of the settings rule and one of the best ways to ensure the quality of the services people receive. This webinar will review Appendix E, participant direction in the HCBS waiver application, and how components of the settings rule can be embedded in Appendix E. The presentation will cover components in the waiver that structure how participant direction, otherwise known as self-direction or consumer direction, will be offered in a state, and how stakeholders can have an impact on the application. After the presentation, we'll have time for questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A portion. Oh, whoops, I went back too far. There we go. So sorry about that. I would like to start by introducing our speakers. First, we'll start with Nancy Thaler. Nancy Thaler is currently Senior Policy Advisor at ACL. Following 8 years working as a community provider developing community services for children and adults with intellectual disabilities, Ms. Thaler joined the Pennsylvania state government in 1987 and served as the Deputy Secretary for the Office of Developmental Programs from 1993 to 2003. Ms. Thaler served as the Director of Quality Improvement for the HHS Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services from 2003 to 2006. And was responsible for developing the state application for 1915C HCBS waiver programs. Ms. Thaler was appointed Executive Director for the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services in 2007, serving in that role until 2015, when she returned to serve as Pennsylvania's Deputy Secretary for the Office of Developmental Programs until 2018. Ms. Thaler is currently Senior Policy Advisor to the Administration for Community Living. She has a Bachelor of Arts and an honorary doctorate from College Misericordia and a Master's of Human Organization Science and Public Administration from Villanova University. Ms. Thaler and her husband are the parents of an adult son with developmental disabilities. Next, I'd like to introduce Kate Murray, who's President of Applied Self-Direction. She has deep expertise relating to regulatory compliance in Medicaid-funded self-direction programs with a focus on labor and workforce issues. She's a nationally recognized expert on the Department of Labor's Home Care Final Rule that revised Fair Labor Standards Act requirements for home care workers, and she has consulted to numerous state Medicaid agencies and Medicaid managed care organizations on labor and workforce issues. Kate previously served as a senior policy analyst at the National Resource Center for Participant-Directed Services at Boston College, with a focus on innovative, practical technical assistance for self-direction stakeholders. Prior to that, Kate worked as a senior medical economist in Medicaid managed care, focusing on LTSS utilization and expenditures among high-risk dual-eligible populations. She received her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College with a double major in government and Asian and Middle Eastern studies. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy Thaler, who will start the presentation on this slide that I accidentally skipped over to.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin. And thanks to our interpreters and Kate and everybody who's on the webinar today. So this is the fourth. You've seen me before and other people before. This is the fourth webinar in our series. And so one or two of these slides are going to be familiar to you. Why are we talking about the waiver application? Because it's really important. It is the foundation for how you get services. And because CMS expects considerable stakeholder engagement when states develop these waivers or amend their waivers, it's important that all stakeholders have a solid understanding for how this waiver application works. So just to remind you, it's where states describe for CMS who they're going to serve, how many people they're going to serve, which means whether there are waiting lists or not, what type of services they're going to provide, and how much of those services, how frequently can you get it, how long can a session be. It describes what protections there are in place for your health and safety. This is today's discussion it is where the states determine whether they will allow self-direction or not, and how they will follow the HCBS rule. And the thing that's important to know about the waiver application, once it's approved, the state must implement it as approved. And only what is in the waiver can't be approved. So states can't add to it unless they go back and amend it. But whatever is in it, you are entitled to once you are enrolled in the program. Next slide. So the waiver is made up of appendices. There is a basic information section that, and in that basic information section, in that first chapter, if you will, that's where the state is supposed to describe what public input looks like in their state. And then, as you can see, there's Appendix A through J. We, in our second webinar, we did participant services. In our third webinar, we did participant-centered service planning, which you can get on our website. And today we're going to focus on participant direction, or self-direction, it's often called. And I want to say a little bit about it before Kate takes over. The concept of self-determination or self-direction or consumer direction, the idea that the person themselves manages resources or workers, goes back at least to the late 80s, early 90s with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I guess I would say about this appendix, there's a warning. It's probably the most complicated of the appendices because there are so many choices to make. When self-direction first started, way back when, before people did it in the waiver, it was very open. People got a fixed amount of money, a budget, and they hired and determined who was going to work and did all that directly. No fiscal intermediaries, support brokers, all of that. And then shortly after self-direction started to take off, people realized we need to pay income tax and FICA and maybe workman's compensation. And there are a lot of rules related to employment that cannot be overlooked here. It's not just hiring a babysitter and paying them under the table. It's got to be done within all the regulatory and legal structures that involve employment. And that's when self-direction introduced the concept of financial management service, support brokers, etc. So it's complicated because there are a lot of rules to follow, even if you are your own employer or you manage your own budget. So I've asked Kate to do this with me because she spends her entire life living and breathing self-direction and provides a lot of consultation to a lot of states. And I thought it would be good for her to bring both her enthusiasm and her deep knowledge and experience. So, Kate, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for that great introduction and history. I'm really excited to be on with all of you today because I think learning to read these very lengthy, very complex waivers is one of the best tools that people can have as far as advocacy, and not only understanding what their options are in their state and how their state has structured services, but also what's going on in other states. At Applied Self-Direction, probably the most common question we get, number one, all-time most asked question is, how do other states do this? And we get that question from other states. We get it from participants and families. We get it from folks in Australia and all over the world asking, you know, how are these things structured? And the answer is right here in the waiver, specifically in Appendix E, which is all about, as Nancy was saying, participant direction. And when we say that, we mean a model of service delivery in which participants have authentic decision-making authority over how, when, and from whom their services and supports are delivered. And that links to a much larger philosophy of self-determination. But when we're talking about self-direction or participant direction for waiver purposes, that's really what we're talking about. We're thinking about those services and supports that the person is directing. Depending on the state you live in, This model might be called self-direction, it might be called consumer direction. There are a lot of different terms for this and significant variations in terms of how states can structure them, which makes it hard to talk about in some ways. And that's another reason why learning to read these waivers and being able to identify these commonalities across different waivers and state designs for these programs is so important. So today I'm going to show some screenshots from the waiver application where states describe how they've structured self-directed services. So next slide, please. All right, so if you're pulling up a waiver and you want to figure out if that waiver even has self-directed services, if it's the first one you've ever pulled up and you're not quite sure, you're going to want to go to Appendix E. And this is just a rule of thumb that I've discovered that can make life a lot easier. If you want to skip exactly to that place in the waiver application, you can actually go to find in your browser window or your PDF reader or whatever you use to look at waivers, and you can type in Appendix E and then a colon, and that colon will actually take you exactly to the place in the waiver where Appendix E is. So that's just a little tip that I've learned from spending way too many hours digging into these things. But this is where the state's going to describe, first and foremost, whether the waiver even provides participant direction opportunities. So this is the first thing you're going to see once you get to Appendix E. And as we know, waivers can be hundreds. I've seen waivers in the thousands of pages. So this is the first thing you're going to see. And if the waiver says no, this waiver does not provide participant direction opportunities, that's all you need to know. Look no further. There is no participant direction in that particular waiver. However, more and more waivers are offering this model of service delivery. And as of 2023, 45 states and the District of Columbia currently offer participant-directed services through the 1915C waiver. So not all participant-directed services are offered through waivers. There are some other pathways through the Medicaid program, but the 1915C waiver is the most common pathway, kind of by far, that states use to offer participant direction within Medicaid. So the majority, over half of 1915C waivers now offer at least some participant-directed services, which is wonderful. And we continue to see that number going up kind of in the wake of the pandemic. So one theme you're going to hear a lot today from me is that it's important to recognize when you're looking at this section that every waiver is very, very unique in how it offers participant-directed services. No two waivers are the same, even within the same state. And when you're comparing waivers from state to state, it can look very different. And some of that is because states will use different terms to describe the same concepts. As we were saying, some states it's called self-direction, in other states it's called participant direction. And so when you learn to read these Appendix E's, which are there and they're pretty readable, but they're just kind of buried deeply in there, it can really give you a lot of insight in terms of being able to compare different programs. And even though the language and the terminology might be different, you can kind of also compare how they're similar. So it's a great way, reading the Appendix E is a really great way to learn how participant direction works all over the country and about the possibilities of this model. So next slide, please. So in Appendix E1, the state is going to describe how participant-directed services are designed within the context of that particular waiver and how they'll operate. And so two really important concepts to be familiar with, and I know many of the folks on our attendees today are familiar with these concepts, are what CMS calls employer authority, budget authority, or both. And so we'll talk about these in the next slide. So next slide, please. So employer authority is a concept that it's a term that CMS uses, and it is a concept where a state can choose to include employer authority in its participant-directed services. And in employer authority, the participant will recruit, hire, supervise, and direct the workers who furnish supports. So this is a big deal. And I would say this is probably what we think of when we think of participant direction. We think of a participant who is selecting their own staff. They are the employer of that worker. They are setting that person's schedule. They're managing the performance. If the person isn't working out as a worker, if they're not providing satisfactory performance, the participant may terminate their employment. And so that is what CMS is talking about when they talk about employer authority within the context of the waiver application. And it is a concept that is unique to participant direction. But there's another component that states can choose to build into their programs as well. And this is the concept known as budget authority. So in this, with budget authority, the participant will manage a flexible budget. And not all programs have budget authority, but a lot of programs, a lot of waivers, I will say, with participant direction will offer participant directed services that have both employer authority and budget authority. And this is becoming more common over time. And in an employer authority only model, we typically see services authorized in hours where, let's say, a participant might be authorized, let's say 20 hours a week of personal supports, and they can select their own staff who's going to provide that service and manage their hours and all of that. In a budget authority environment, the participant isn't going to receive that authorization of 20 hours. Instead, they might be told, okay, you have a certain amount of money to that you can pay your staff to provide personal supports. So there's a little bit more flexibility there because the participant can set rates of pay for their staff. Often you'll see states setting a maximum that can be paid for a wage rate, but participants might have significant discretion as far as, being able to give raises, deciding that, certain workers might be more efficient than others and being able to adjust their pay rates. So budget authority it's not something that's offered through every waiver, but it is an option to states when they are designing participant directed services within a waiver. And so it's something that I just want to talk about, and I'll be coming back to these concepts, but they're concepts that can be offered separately or together. And another cool feature of budget authority is that if the state selects this option in their waiver application, participants can potentially use their budget to purchase goods and non-employee services. So again, the participant is managing a flexible budget within waivers with budget authority. And so they may be able to use otherwise unused budget dollars to purchase things that are going to help their community integration, help them manage their disability, and things like that. So we'll talk more about these concepts, but I just wanted to go through them because these are tricky to wrap your head around, I think, if you've never heard them before. And so I just wanted to make sure we understood this terminology because it comes up quite a bit throughout Appendix E. So let's see, next slide, please. So next in the waiver application, the state is going to ask about how people get information about this option. So if you're someone who's receiving waiver services, who is telling you about participant direction if it's something that the waiver offers? What are your responsibilities going to be if you choose to self-direct your waiver services? Who is responsible for telling the person that? How it's provided timely? And so these are all things that states have to talk about. And we most often see, I would say, we see case managers providing that kind of initial information about participant direction to people receiving waiver services. But it's something that I think is really important because we hear time and again that people often make their decision about whether to participate in this model based on that initial conversation. And so it's a conversation, I think it's very important for states to make sure that whoever is offering this information to participants is getting it right, that they understand what they're offering, that they're familiar with the rules and requirements of the program, as well as the benefits, and that they're not steering people. So it so often comes down to this very first conversation. So making sure that conversation is accessible for folks, it's not overwhelming, that people can get their questions answered, and that they feel confident, like they have a true informed choice, which is essential when it comes to this model. Is all of those things are things that are worth focusing on, I think, for states. And your waiver, your state and your waivers rules are going to be found in this Appendix E1E section. So next slide, please. So the next slide has to do with representatives. So the state, you'll see in this screenshot here that the state is asked to specify whether people can participate in self-direction or participant direction with a representative. And so the representative is someone who can be appointed if a participant is unable or unwilling to perform the duties of an employer and potentially manage a budget if the waiver has budget authority. Representatives are expected to act in the best interest of the participant. And it's really important for states to build in safeguards to make sure that anybody appointed as a representative by a participant is acting in their best interest. Most states, nearly all, it may be all states at this point, I'm not 100% sure, but virtually all states allow for using representatives. And it's very, I would say it's most common, you see it most often in waivers that target children. And the state has the option to require any representative to be a legal guardian of the participant. You typically see that, as I was saying, in waivers that target children, because, you know, a 3-year-old, for example, might really benefit from participant-directed services, but legally, as a 3-year-old, they cannot enter into contracts. And so a parent or legal guardian would be performing those decisions on their behalf, choosing who to hire, that kind of thing. But the majority of waivers with participant direction allow the participant to designate anyone they know and trust to be their representative. So it does not necessarily have to be a legal guardian for most waivers. It could be, but it just doesn't have to be. We often see other folks, like a different family member, a sibling perhaps, a adult child, or a trusted friend, a faith leader. Those are all common selections that we see when people are unable, or they just simply don't want to deal with the responsibilities of participant direction. They still want to participate in it, but they have a family member who is going to help with some of the paperwork, some of the maybe recruiting staff, that kind of thing. So representatives are really important because they expand the accessibility of participant direction very significantly, particularly, I think, most notably for children who can really benefit from this model, but otherwise wouldn't be able to participate because of the responsibilities placed on participants. So the representative is a very, very important support available for participants. Next slide here. I could talk about all of these for all day and frequently do, but I'm trying to not be too wordy here. So the next section, I think, is really important. It is actually a chart, as you can see here. It is Appendix E1G, where the state is required to list every single service that can be directed by waiver participants. And it also has to specify whether that service has employer authority, budget authority, or both. So if the service isn't listed here in this table in Appendix E1G, where it says participant-directed services, it can't be self-directed. If the service is listed here, it can be self-directed. And so, you know, I've had conversations with advocates where they said, we had no idea this service was even available through the waiver and that it could be self-directed. No one had talked with them about the waiver. No one had checked the waiver that they had talked to. And so it was eye-opening for them to actually go in this section and say, wow, okay, this actually is offered through the waiver. So it's a very important section. I think one of the most important sections where you can just see every single option available. As Nancy was saying, I mean, whatever is in the waiver is, you know, that is what is on record with CMS. So if someone tells you you can't get that service or that service isn't available through the waiver, this is, I would say, kind of the source of truth as far as what the state has agreed with CMS to offer as far as participant-directed services. Next slide, please. All right, so the next slide has to do with financial management services, or FMS. And Nancy talked a little bit about this, but this is a really key support of participants who self-direct. So in your state, it may be called FMS, it may be called a fiscal management service, it may be called fiscal intermediary, fiscal employer agent, intermediary service organization. There are so many names for this concept that it's a little bit overwhelming. But when we're talking about FMS, financial management services, we're talking about the payroll guys, the tax people, the people that are managing a bunch of paperwork and administrative responsibilities on behalf of people who self-direct. And the reason we have FMS is because it's pretty complicated being an employer. There's a lot of requirements, kind of legal requirements that you have to follow as an employer. And if you want to manage your own staff and choose who's working for you and do all of that stuff, you legally are considered an employer under federal and state law. So that means we get bound up in all these employer requirements. And that's where FMS comes in. So the FMS entity is going to manage a lot of those sort of compliance, administrative paperwork, payroll responsibilities, things that are kind of just have to be dealt with and that are very important to make sure that someone acting as their own employer can be sustainable. And so the FMS is a critical function, I would say. And as you can see here, there are different ways FMS can be provided. It can be furnished through a third-party entity. Typically, we see private entities that really specialize in this service acting as FMS entities. That's the most common approach. So if you're looking through waivers, you'll typically see that private entities box checked most of the time because that is the most common approach. State and local governments can also provide FMS, but it's a very important function to make sure all those employer responsibilities are taken care of correctly and on time. In some cases, occasionally you'll see states check the box that say FMS are not furnished. And in those cases, typically what we see is that workers who are providing participant-directed services are just submitting, claims or something to the state directly. But that's a pretty rare approach, and more we see states choosing to offer FMS because it's something that really helps make these programs sustainable, and it makes things a lot easier on participants and families who want to take advantage of participant-directed services, but don't want to have to think about, Social Security and Medicare taxes and unemployment and workers' compensation. They can just kind of have it handled for them, and they're in good shape and they're protected, and everything is where it needs to be, and that's what FMS is all about. Next slide, please. All right, so the next section is another participant support. So we've talked about representatives, we've talked about financial management services, and now we're going to talk about a concept CMS calls information and assistance. This function may go by a different name in your state. It might not be called information and assistance in support of participant direction, but I'll tell you how CMS describes it and see if it sounds familiar. So CMS says, states are required to provide or arrange for the provision of a system of supports that are responsive to an individual's needs and desires for assistance in developing the person-centered service plan and budget plan, managing the individual's services and workers, and performing the responsibilities of an employer. This might mean information regarding how a self-directed program works, individual rights and responsibilities, available resources, counseling, training, assistance, and access to an independent advocacy system available in the state. So that's a lot of information, but it really boils down to there needs to be resources and people available to participants who want to self-direct, are interested in participating in this model, who may not, for example, feel that comfortable serving as their employer for the first time. The average person has probably never been an employer before. There might be questions about program rules and requirements, or what can I do in this program? What am I not allowed to do in this program? I have no idea how to recruit my own staff. All of these, very common questions and concerns boil down to information and assistance. And it is required for states to make sure there is someone there who can answer folks' questions. How that gets offered, how the service gets offered is structured very differently in different states. So depending on where you live, you might be more familiar with the term support broker. You might have heard the term counselor or consultant, independent facilitator, or some other term. There are a bunch of them. Self-direction assistant is a term in some states. But the idea is there's someone who's there to coach, to advise, to give you information as you need it. They might be independent. They might work for a provider agency. They might work for the FMS entity. In other cases, it might be your case manager or care coordinator who's performing this function all on their own. So as you can see here from this waiver application screenshot, there are several different options of how this can be performed. But the main takeaway here is that no matter how the state chooses to structure it, there needs to be that high quality, consistent information available to people. There needs to be help if people have questions, if people aren't sure how to do something. There needs to be help getting up that learning curve, because there is some learning curve in participant direction. So in this area, the state is going to describe how they're structuring it and how they're offering it. And this is always required in participant direction. I think that's really important to mention, because it is such an important component of making participant directed services accessible. Next slide, please. The next slide is around independent advocacy. And I will just note, I meant to say this earlier, I have not taken screenshots of every single piece of Appendix E. It's quite long and lengthy, but I was trying to pull out the main highlights, the things that are, I think, most important for participants and families. I tried to leave out the kind of more technical stuff around how these services are financed. Things that don't matter so much for participants and families are more important for state budget people. But I just mentioned that because if you're trying to follow along in the waiver application, there are sections we're skipping over, but we're trying to really get the greatest hits of Appendix E today. And one of those greatest hits is independent advocacy, which is not required in a waiver. CMS does not require it as a federal requirement, but states can choose to offer it. And so in this section, they'll say whether they have chosen to offer opportunities for independent advocacy. But this might be, a paid advocate working on behalf of an advocacy organization. It could be a peer support specialist. An individual support broker may be required to notify participants around opportunities for independent advocacy. But when we talk about independent advocacy, we really mean person-specific advocacy as opposed to advocacy on behalf of an entire class of people. So again, this is something that's optional, but I would say most waivers do offer opportunities for independent advocacy. And keep us moving here. Next slide, please. So the next section is around voluntary termination of participant direction. So it's important to keep in mind that participant direction is always going to be an option, no matter where you live, what waiver you're enrolled in. Participants are never required to self-direct. It may be, the waiver that you're enrolled in is a fully self-directed waiver. If you no longer want to participate, you might get moved to a different waiver. But participant direction is never something that people are forced to participate in. And participants can disenroll at any time for any reason. And that is kind of where this section of the Appendix E comes into play. States have to have processes in place to ensure service continuity for people who no longer want to self-direct or are able to. So if someone is leaving the participant direction on a voluntary basis, the state really has to describe here what happens next. Is there a meeting with the case manager? How are they transitioned back to a different model of service delivery? And so this is a very important section to make sure that people can leave participant direction safely if it's not working out for them or if something in their life has changed. And let's see, next slide, please. On a very related note, the state also has to describe procedures for involuntary termination of participant direction. which is similar. Of course, the main difference here is that the person is not choosing to terminate. They are having to leave participant direction for some other reason. Sometimes it might be a health and safety issue. It might be not being able to follow program rules. It might be, for example, a child might have a parent serving as a representative for them, and then the minor child's parent is no longer able to serve in that representative role. That would be a pretty common example of an involuntary termination situation. So just like voluntary termination, states still have to ensure service continuity and prevent service disruption if someone is involuntarily disenrolled. So this is a very important section to make sure that there are safeguards in place to protect against service disruption and protect service continuity if someone has to leave participant direction for any reason. Next slide, please. All right, so the next part of the Appendix E has to do with that concept we were talking about known as employer authority. And this is a term that CMS created to describe waivers in which participants or their representatives are selecting, they're recruiting, they're hiring their own staff, they're managing their staff, they're directing their performance, setting their schedules, all that stuff. When participants can do this within a waiver, that waiver, the CMS says that waiver offers what's called employer authority. However, under employer authority, the employment relationship between the participant and their worker can be structured in two different ways. I would say these two ways are more similar than they are different, but they're slightly different. And it is the state's option to offer one or both of these options. So some states allow participants the option to be the sole employer or a co-employer. You can see these two options here. Other states only offer one model. When the participant acts as the quote unquote common law employer or the sole employer, that means that the participant or their representative is the sole employer of the workers they hire. There's no other entity involved, legally speaking, between the participant and their worker. The participant truly is the boss, not only philosophically, but legally for all legal purposes. The participant is likely going to use a financial management services entity that's going to handle their payroll and administrative responsibilities for them. So, in this model, the participant might use an FMS to, for example, cut checks to their staff to make sure that their staff get paid regularly and file taxes on their behalf, but there's no agency involved in the employment relationship. So obviously there's a very high degree of choice and control in this model because there's no one else kind of dictating the employment relationship and how things are going to go, making decisions other than the participant and maybe a representative. As you can see in the waiver application, there's also this option for what CMS calls a co-employer model. And so in this model, the participant is going to be sharing employer responsibilities with an agency. So what we typically see in a co-employer model is that the participant is going to select their own staff, just like in sole employer. They're going to set their staff schedule, manage day-to-day performance. And if a worker is not meeting their needs, they're probably going to tell the agency, hey, I don't want this person anymore. They're not meeting my needs, or, this person is presenting some HR issues, something like that. And the co-employer agency, sometimes this is known as an agency with choice, may be able to assist with some of this stuff. For example, they might be able to help participants with worker recruitment. If a participant has a shift that they can't fill, the agency may be able to say, hey, we actually have someone in your area. Would you like to have them come out for that shift? So it's a little bit closer to traditional agency services potentially, but there's still a lot of choice and control for participants in this model. There are also some sort of different kind of legal underpinnings to this model that makes it easier for an agency with choice to be able to offer worker benefits like health insurance. So there are some slight differences in terms of these models. I would not say that one is necessarily better than the other, but there's just some differences. Although at the end of the day, the most important thing is that true participant choice and control is upheld, and that can be upheld in either or both of these models. So in this section, you can see what your state has selected. They might have selected sole employer, or what we call common law employer. They might have selected co-employer, or what's sometimes called agency with choice. And the state will describe what the specific responsibilities the participants are going to manage in either or both of these models. Next slide, please. All right, so next, we're going back to that budget authority concept. And again, not all waivers with participant-directed services offer budget authority, but a lot do. And when a waiver does offer budget authority, that means the participant is controlling a flexible budget. It's often a dollar amount. It might be a dollar amount per month. It might be a dollar amount per year, depending on how the state structures it. But you might be wondering, how is that budget amount created? So in Appendix E to B, states have to describe the methodology they use to set the amount of the participant-directed budget. And they also have to say, they have to describe how participants get informed about the budget amount that they're going to receive. So this is a question we get a lot, is how do states develop budget amounts? And I always say this is the section of the waiver you need to look at. It's very different state to state. There are different ways to do it, but the answer to your question is going to be found in Appendix E to B, where they're talking about that budget amount, and they're talking about the methodology that the state uses to establish the amount of that budget for services, as well as potentially, some other, waiver goods, for example, depending on how the state sets it up. So this has to be publicly available. It cannot be a secret, and it's a really important tool, I think, for advocates. It's one of those things, it's publicly available information, it's on the record, it's just hard to find, and this is where you're going to find it. And so it can be really helpful, I think, for advocates to reference this section in waivers from other states to see how your state is similar or different from others. So, and I will also say that if the waiver doesn't offer budget authority, this section is going to be left blank. Next slide, please. All right. So this is another interesting piece of budget authority as well in Appendix E to B. So there's this little section in the waiver called Participant Exercise of Budget Flexibility. And states here have the option to select. This isn't one of those sections where the state can select both. They have to select one or the other. And states have the option to require that a participant service plan has to be changed before the participant can modify the services they spend their budget on. Or in waivers with really flexible budget authority, the participant can change the services they purchase with their budget without changing their service plan first. And so I realize this is a little bit confusing and technical, but what I mean by this is, for example, if someone's service plan was set up so that someone was going to receive a particular amount of personal supports, and then they were going to spend $200 on home modifications for that month. And let's say something happened with that participant where, the natural support they were using is no longer able to provide services, and so they need more paid personal support. The participant could say, all right, I'm actually not going to spend my budget on that $200 of home mods this month. I'm going to move that to personal supports because I need more paid support than we originally planned for at the time. So in some ways, it's a small difference, but it's one of those things where states can offer really flexible budget authority through the waiver. And this is one of those things where a little change like this can make a big impact as far as being able to make changes to the waiver flexibly and rapidly for participants. So it's something to look at for sure. And states can specify here, I didn't include the text box, but there's a text box that goes with this where states can really talk about what their process is if someone needs to modify their service plan or their participant-directed budget. And so a very interesting section, but I will wrap up my comments on the Appendix E. I hope you enjoyed this kind of crash course. and looking forward to questions on this. I tried to hit the greatest hits, but if you have any questions, please share them in the chat at the end, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, I think that sends it back over to Nancy to take the next
Great.
few.
There were some questions in the chat. Kate and I will try to address and then take any additional ones that you have. How can a care navigator direct a consumer or caregiver to different waivers available in their state? Typically, every state has a website and they tell you what services are available. I also put in the, I guess I could put it in this question too, the link to the CMS website that has all the state waivers. So when you go to that website, you can query up the state and then what kind of waiver, typically 1915C, and they will all come up and you will see this, the CMS approval letter, and you will see the state's full waiver application there. The slides and the recording for this session will be available on our website. Shana asks, how many states offer employer authority or budget authority? And I have no idea, but I'm wondering if Kate does.
Yes, that's a great question. I would need to look at my, little analytics spreadsheets and things to get the exact numbers, but off the cuff, it's about, I would say 50-50 as far as the percentage of waivers that offer employer authority only versus about 50% of waivers that offer employer plus budget authority. Again, that's a rough approximation, but I think it's about half and half. And we are seeing the number of waivers that offer employer authority, budget authority, in addition to employer authority, going up over time.
And then we have another question. Why don't you take this one, Kate? And that is, if someone decides to do self-direction for any one service, are they all in for all the services, or can you do some self-direction and some not self-direction?
That's a great question. And it depends on the waiver, but increasingly we're seeing states design their waivers so that people have the option where they can self-direct as much or as little as they want to. There are some waivers out there where every single service is only participant directed, but if you don't want to self-direct your services, you get moved to a different waiver. But for the most part, most of the waivers we see now say, okay, here are the services within the waiver. There's an option. You can self-direct this service if you want to. And so someone might say, okay, I want all traditional services, but I just want to self-direct my respite. Or, I just want to self-direct my personal support, or whatever the case may be, transportation. So we're seeing it become more common for states to allow folks to kind of mix and match as far as whether they want to do just, one or two services, or they want to fully self-direct everything.
And then sort of along the same lines, this is a mix and match thing. If in Appendix C, which is the service appendix, the service method is only provider managed, but it says legally responsible relatives can be paid, does that mean the legally responsible relative would be hired through a provider agency and not by the beneficiary? The answer is yes, unless the state has a way for an individual person to enroll as a Medicaid provider on their own. Also, someone asked, how could you see the waiver application without it being a specific state? And I inserted in the chat box the link to access the waiver application. If you look at the last slide in this PowerPoint, if you have it, or maybe the next to the last slide, Erin could put it up, you'll see that that website's a little complicated. When you go to that website, we have directions on here on how to look for the waiver application and what to click on so that you get access to it. Michelle asks, is this similar to consumer choice option? I think so, but the way you've capitalized it, I think you might mean something else.
Yes, so I know, I believe Iowa has what they call the consumer choice option, which is a participant-directed option. So if you are, the person asking this question is from Iowa, that is indeed what we've been talking about. And if you pull up any of your state's waivers, they'll be talking about the consumer choice option within their Appendix E.
The next question is with regards to support brokerage, and Kate, I'm going to ask you because you've looked at so many of them. Can you ballpark rates for that? How is it structured? Is there, I think, a billing code is the question, and is it funded out of the person's individual budget? There are a lot of questions packed into that one.
This is a great question. It's a whole webinar, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. It's such a good question. So support broker rates are all over the place because there's differences in the ways that states structure them. Some states will do this as a kind of per member per month fee, where let's say you're providing services to someone and as a support broker, and you might get, I'm just making this number up. This is not a real number. You might get $50 per person per month. In a different state, it may be you, the support broker, are billing for every 15 minutes that you spend working with that person as their support broker. And there are definitely trade-offs in terms of what that means for brokers and participants and states and how this can all work. So it's really all over the place, but it is something that, the rates tend to be publicly available for support broker services, so you can sort of compare in different states. The code is T2041. That's the HCBS code for support broker. There's also kind of I believe a per diem code that's T2051 for support brokerage. And in some cases, it is funded out of the participant's budget, where the participant, if they're really relying on their support broker, they need more time. They may have no clue where to start as far as recruiting workers, and they're using more of their broker's time. That might mean that they have fewer budget dollars left over to spend on services because they're really working with the support broker. And then in other cases, you might have someone who knows exactly who they want to hire. And in that case, they might not need as much support broker time, so less money comes out of the budget. In other cases, we see this, as I had mentioned before, as a per member per month kind of administrative fee that is paid for outside of the budget. So lots of variation on support brokerage. And I could talk about it more, but I'm trying to wrap this up. So
Good.
That's all I'll say on that.
A few more questions. Can you talk about why an 1115B waiver is used instead of a 1915C? Yes, I will do an abbreviated version of this. 1915C, home and community-based waiver, is the statutory authority to provide services. They're in the statute. There's a small list of them, but states all do other, that would otherwise not be available in Medicaid. So really 1915C is about the services, and it mandates that you have choice of provider, choice of where you live, lots of choice. And 1115B, invented, I think, by Michigan quite a while ago, limits choice. When states get approval to do it in 1115B, it's often what they use to do managed care. It restricts or limits the amount of choice that a state has to provide to a participant. Are states required, Kate, to have more than one self-directed agency? And I think whether that means agency with choice or fiscal intermediary or broker. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I would agree. Choice is important. Certainly, that's a paramount value of the participant-directed model. So states can set up their financial management services function and also their information assistance function mostly how they want. There are some CMS requirements and guidelines, but there's a lot of room for state discretion there. So states are not required to use more than one financial management services entity, although this is a really common request from advocates, so that if there's one FMS that's not working for them, they might have somewhere else to go, or they can, kind of shop around and see who works best for them. So it's not required, but it is something that is a very common advocate request, and it's something that states have the option to require in their state. It's simply not a federal requirement. And similarly, on the support brokerage side, the state has a lot of discretion in terms of how they structure that. They're not necessarily required to have more than one support brokerage entity if they're doing it as an administrative function, but certainly something that tends to be very important for advocates.
One question is whether there are any states that offer medical benefits or bonuses or anything other than a wage to workers who are in self-direction.
Great question. There are states that offer some of these things. We saw a lot of kind of one-off bonuses, hazard pay, COVID-related relief being paid out during the pandemic. But in terms of health insurance, that is more common in the kind of agency with choice model or the co-employer model that we were talking about. So in states with an agency with choice model, generally the agency with choice is going to offer the option for full-time employees to participate in a health plan. What we can see sometimes, or what we often hear happening, is that the wage rate might be a little lower in those states because health insurance can be very expensive. And so in a state where, maybe health insurance isn't offered, the wage rate might be a little higher. But I would be looking for agency with choice states for the most part. And then as far as bonuses, bonuses can be paid by individual employers who are participating in waivers that offer budget authority. So bonuses are something that can be done in a budget authority context. In terms of more kind of systematic bonuses, I don't know of any states that have really worked those in at this time on a statewide level, but it is something that takes place quite commonly at an individual employer level in waivers with budget authority.
There was a question at one point, I'm not sure it's up there now, about how you can find this stuff out. And I would say there are two ways. One is sign up to get stuff from Kate's website. And they periodically showcase, highlight, and do reports and summaries. And other than that, I think you have to go into state waiver applications and read them one by one to discover what each unique state offers. Do individuals living in group homes need to transition out of group home services to participate in self-direction? Theoretically, no, but practically, I think that's true. I don't think there are any states that so when you think about residential services, that's a service that's a combination of lots and lots of different functions and services, right? Direct care staff, there might be nursing, housekeeping. It's just the whole sort of, I don't want to use the word wraparound, but wraparound. And so once you're in a group home, you're sort of all bought in with that provider doing everything. Now, remember, in the home and community-based waiver rules, the rule is that even when you're in a provider-owned facility, you have the right and should have a lease that gives you tenant options and does not restrict you from having other services come in. However, I think practically states do not incorporate self-direction into 24-hour residential services. And Kate, do you want to embellish that?
The only thing I would add, is such a great response, is we occasionally hear of self-direction being used in kind of for incidentals, occasional transportation and things like that, but very kind of minimal spending here and there. Maybe a budget is used to purchase a bus pass or something like that. So we do hear a little bit sometimes, but it's pretty rare for a waiver to be structured so that people who live in a group home setting are even able to participate. It occasionally happens, but it tends to be pretty minor.
There's a follow-up question to the 1115 question, and is it do states use 1115 because they want to do managed care? Well, the phrasing, they want a MCO to come in, it's that they want to reconfigure their entire service system to be delivered through managed care organizations. And you will find that it will be more than one managed care organizations. Most states have multiple ones for you to choose from, or they may be designated geographically. But yes, 1115B, the B function, is how services are limited. There's another question about offering workmen's compensation, retention pay, and workers' health insurance, but I think you have answered that, Kate.
Yeah, for folks looking for more information on how the benefits and bonus piece can work, Oklahoma offered that they offer workers' comp, retention pay, and the possibility to compensate for limited worker health insurance in their program. So really, really cool stuff happening in Oklahoma, and definitely a state to check out on that link that we've provided to all the state waivers.
There's a question about how people can download slides, and ACL has a website where it posts those. Erin, I'm wondering if you could put in the Q&A the link to the website where the webinars are posted.
Yep, we'll do just a minute.
Thank you. What is the best option for adding more social determinants of health type services such as housing supports, non-medical transportation, emergency goods, intensive care coordination, or home clean out, for example? So if you're talking about giving someone the authority to self-direct those services, go back to the waiver in the state, the list of all the services that state chooses to provide. It may provide housekeeping, it may not provide housekeeping. It's really up to the state to decide which services it covers, and you as stakeholders to advocate that certain services be covered. And then when you look at the waiver application, the state will decide for each of those services whether they can be directed by the participant. So it's really the state's waiver. And if there are limits, it's because the state has chosen to limit them. Now, having said that, there are some things that are not Medicaid eligible. They're not eligible for FFP under the waiver. There are considerable restrictions around housing. There's some housing assistance in housing location and learning to be a good tenant, but Medicaid will not pay for housing itself. It will pay, absolutely, the waiver pays for non-medical transportation, goods and services. I'm not sure the term intensive care coordination, certainly the Medicaid waiver pays for care coordination or support coordination, or case management it's called, and that can be paid for in the waiver, or it can be paid through a targeted case management amendment. And of course, if you're living in a state that uses managed care, you're going to get support coordination from your MCO. And yes, the slides will be available for download when they are posted. There's a question about the state having an 1115 waiver that's expired and the demonstration is pending. I'm sorry, I can't answer that without knowing specifically. If a waiver is expired, it means it's expired and it's not functioning anymore, and people shouldn't be getting services. Often the waiver is up for renewal and it may have exceeded the expiration date, but CMS extends the length of that waiver through because they're asking for additional information. So my advice would be to ask the state agency about the status of their 1115. And my friend Julie Petty is asking, this may be a silly question, but do states use 1915B and C combined? Absolutely. That's usually called a combination or a combo. And it means that they're using a C waiver and B to limit choice. Again, that's how states do managed care. In Maryland, the waiver can very recently offer participants, employees, PTO, health insurance. So you're letting us know that in Maryland, the waiver does offer self-directed workers, health insurance, holiday pay, if it can be accommodated in the personal budget. It's great. It's expanded flexibility. It's terrific. Yes, all the previous webinars are available for viewing and downloading. Do any states allow legally responsible individuals to be the individual's provider under self-direction? That's a touchy one. Kate, you want to take that?
Yes, certainly not all, but this is something that I would say this is a trend we're seeing coming out of the pandemic. It was pretty uncommon for this to be allowable pre-pandemic. What we saw was that during the public health emergency, states were really scrambling, and a lot of them allowed this kind of payment of legally responsible individuals. This can include potentially power of attorney, rep payees, or payees, and parents of minor children, spouses, to be paid providers under self-direction. Of course, the public health emergency is now expiring, so a lot of those kind of Appendix K emergency policies are being rolled back. A lot of them are being made permanent within the kind of base waiver through the Appendix E, like we've been talking about. But certainly there are, I think, more states than ever allowing this, but it is still not kind of a majority practice at this point in time. And, you often see states saying, well, we only allow this if the person shows that there's no one else available who's qualified, that kind of thing. So we do see some kind of qualifications around this, caveats, and of course, under CMS requirements, that legally responsible individual must meet all provider qualifications without exception to provide the service. But it is something that we're seeing, I think, more of. And of course, the workforce crisis is also driving, I think, some states in this direction.
To expand that topic, another question might be, can a guardian or someone with legal responsibility both direct the service and also be paid as a caregiver? That is, make all determinations for the person about who gets hired and what they get paid, and also be the person that gets paid. And I don't know if any state allows that now. I think possibly they do, but that can really compromise the person's autonomy and needs to be done with caution. Can participants who want to self-direct be in shared living homes? I think, again, that's state specific. In many states, shared living is like a residential service. It's considered responsible for everything, for transportation, for getting people to what they want. And in that case, it would be more difficult if shared living is simply paying for room and board and the companionship, but things like transportation and other activities or are outside that rate to life sharing. A state could choose to allow self-direction for other services. So again, if you're in shared living, the assumption is you chose that and you directed that choice. Once there, it's up to the state and how they configure the service definition, whether or not everything is provided by that shared living provider or whether there are services outside of that. And I think maybe we have answered all the questions. I think so. So thank you for the comments about the information being helpful. We'll leave the Q&A up a little bit for a minute in case you have additional questions. And you can also email those of us, Erin and I at ACL. Our addresses are always our name with a period in between, and aclhhs.org or .gov. And I think you have, Kate, did we provide your information in the slide? Great.
Yes.
And I would encourage you to get on the website and see the wealth of resources and information.
And I will also note, we're going to be sending out a survey via email following the webinar, and we would appreciate your feedback as we continue to work on how the series is evolving moving forward. So thank you.
And if you have ideas about webinars you'd like ACL to provide on topics that you'd like to know about and have posted so you have access to them, please let us know. So thank you to Kate, thank you to the interpreters, to Marcia who set this up, and to Erin, and thank you to all of you. Until next time, have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.